As these days I get very tired and am often feeling unwell, the organisers of this conference decided that they would make a recording which could be played at the conference, and this is what I'm going to do. The problem I had, of course, was that they didn't tell me what I should talk about, and I had to decide what my subject should be. I finally decided that the title given to the conference gave me all the information I needed. The conference is on markets, firms, and property rights, and that covers everything I would want to say. Let me start with talking about markets. One of the things that people don't understand is that markets are creations. They are not something which we can find. A market has to be created. In the Journal of Law and Economics, one of the early issues, I published an article on the plywood contract to be shown by the Chicago Board of Trade. It was a very complicated set of negotiations that led to the emergence of the contract. And then, having tried it, it failed. This very much upset the organizer, Mr. Richard Sandor, but it didn't upset me at all, because it showed just how difficult it was to form a contract which people wanted to use in sufficient quantity as to cover the costs. More recently, Richard Sandor has worked on establishing a climate exchange in China, and that took a vast amount of negotiation, and in that case was successful. And the account of this is to be published in a book which all of you will be able to read. Today I thought I'd talk about the subject of the conference: markets, firms, and property rights. Now, as I've said, in the case of markets, they are creations. They don't exist. They are the result of people deciding to make a contract and making all the negotiations necessary to bring it about. Firms are a little different. Firms are usually based initially on the family, and they exist in that form to a large extent today. But firms are not to be analysed in the way I did it in the nature of the firm. The nature of the firm was an article, although published in 1937, which contained my ideas that I developed as an undergraduate. And as I know from a letter which I wrote to Ronald Fowler, the ideas were all there by the time I graduated in 1932. I didn't publish it until 1937, but that's understandable, as I went into teaching in 1932 and knew virtually nothing and had to give 3 courses. So I spent most of my time preparing for my lectures. But I did publish this article in 1937, The Nature of the Firm, and it has been much referred to, much cited, although in fact it's little more than an undergraduate essay. It is also a very poor article, although it's been much referred to. It talked about the firm as if you could talk about it as an entity in economic theory. I said as the firm grew bigger, there was diminishing returns to management. Well, this is treating it as if it was fertilizer being applied to land and you measure the outcome. Idea was you put fertilizer on land and first of all you get extra product, and then you put more on, you get more product, and so on. Then you put more on and it starts killing things, and so you have diminishing returns to the fertilizer. Well, firms aren't like that. Firms are organizations in which the different parts of the firm have an interchange with other parts of the firm. It's a sociological problem rather than an economic problem. And I learned a great deal about how large organizations operate during my war work. When I was in the cabinet office, and I made various studies which had no influence at all. And it was interesting because they didn't not use it because the ideas weren't good, but because it wasn't in the interest of the particular part of the organization to do the work. I made an estimate, for example, of what the imports were going to be in a certain year, and they were going to be much lower than they had been. I worked it out by taking ships that would be lost, ships that would be constructed, turnaround time for ships and so on, and I estimated whereas we'd been importing, say, 36 million tons, we could only import 25 million tons. These are the approximate figures as I remember them. So I went around to the various departments with someone from the economic section who'd had similar views, and we said to the firms, you've got a plan for a much smaller quantity of imports. What are they to be? And all the departments said, oh, we can't give up any imports. We can only do what we're doing. And so no plans were made. The ships picked up whatever was on the wharf, chicken feed or whatever it was, and didn't bring in the things that were more important. However, since my predictions were pretty accurate, by luck I think, they made their changes for next year. So you had a whole year lost. I remember another calculation I made, more specifically dealing with the subject that I was mainly concerned, tanks, guns, rifles, ammunition and such like. Well, I took the number of people who were in the various theatres of war and said what they should have in the way of equipment and ammunition and so on. And I found that, of course, some theatres of war were well stocked and some were badly stocked. And what should happen was that we should rectify this and make sure that everyone got the proper amount. This report, I call it the balance sheet, was produced for about 3 months, after which it was stopped. And the reason it was stopped was that it showed where the deficiencies were. And no one wanted deficiencies shown. And so no one knew that there were deficiencies. And that has been my experience doing these statistics, that people were always pleased to get a good result published. They never wanted a bad result published. The result is that the people who were running things always got a very wrong idea of what the situation actually was. Well, that's what happened in firms. Also, I discovered, of course, that there were friendships and antagonisms within firms. You know, one part of a firm would feel that another part was always going to mess up what they were doing, and it operated in a very different way from the way it does in economic theory, where you have a firm maximizing profits, knowing all the things that affect it, and acting accordingly. In fact, it's very difficult to imagine that firms act in the way that is described in the textbooks, where you maximize profits by equating marginal costs and marginal revenue. One of the reasons one can feel doubtful about this particular way of looking at things is that firms never calculate marginal costs, and so cannot possibly act in the way described in the textbooks. Well, I think we ought to study directly how firms operate and develop our theory accordingly. Finally, of course, in this conference, I'm going to discuss property rights. To do this, you really have to rely on information gathered from lawyers. However, lawyers are mainly interested in using economic theory to analyze legal doctrines. My view is that at least some of them ought to be doing studies of how the property rights affect the working of the economic system. A lot of this has not been done, and I hope that one of the results of this conference is that people will turn to do this, and then they will study markets, firms, and property rights in what I consider the right way. One of the features of the control of electronic transmission has been the use of auctions to decide who shall have the rights. It happens that I was the person who introduced this to the FCC, which I did at a hearing. I gave my presentation to the commissioners, and then when I'd finished, they started to question me. And the first question I received so astonished me that I didn't know what to say. One of the commissioners said, "Is this all a big joke? The idea that you should actually have an auction for rights to transmit electronic signals was something that they had never even imagined. They had thought their job was to choose the right people to use frequencies, not concern themselves with the question of what was transmitted." Well, I was asked, "Is this all a big joke?" And I sat down there with these people above me, and I didn't know what to say. And I said, "Is it a joke to believe in the American economic system?" And I didn't get any further questions after that. They hadn't realized that that was the way resources are, in fact. Their use is determined in the American economic system. It so happens that I wasn't the first person to mention this. It had been mentioned in a student note in the University of Chicago Law Review. And I asked the student sometime, "How did you get this idea?" And she or he said, "Oh, I took a course from Abba Lerner when he was teaching in America." And this struck me as extraordinary because Abba Lerner was a fellow student of mine at the London School of Economics. And so the idea came back to the London School of Economics anyway, either directly from me or indirectly from Abba Lerner, who I might say was older than the rest of us. He'd been in a printing business that had failed. I always said it was because he put price equal to marginal cost, but that was just a joke. Our relations were always very good, and he ultimately wrote a book on I think it was called The Economics of Control, and a very fine book it is. He was, however, someone who was a socialist, who believed that socialism would be fine if only it carried out the various rules and regulations that he set in motion. I was very interested to see the title of a paper that Richard Posner was going to present, Keynes and Coase. This has puzzled me because I've never had any relationship with Keynes or have worked on the topics that he worked on. I have never worked on the monetary system, foreign exchanges, government finance, and as these were all the topics that Keynes worked on, I was puzzled about what on earth Posner could say, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he will say. You know, in those days, England was still a class system, and Keynes spoke in a different way from me, had a different attitude. He was an old Etonian, and he was one of them, not one of us. And I felt quite different from him, spoke in a different way, and so on. And I only had one contact with him. Once, during the negotiations for the loan from America after the war, I was talking to Keynes' assistant, and Keynes came into the room, and his assistant said, "This is Mr. Coase, who's helping us with the statistics. I don't think you know him." Keynes took my hands and said, "No, I don't think I do," and walked off. And that is my life with Keynes. So I'll be very interested to know what Richard Posner actually says. Although I never had any particular connection with Keynes or his policies, indirectly they had a very important influence on my work. In trying to implement a Keynesian policy, Mead wanted to estimate what the expenditures of firms would be, because, as you know, the basis of the policy was that you estimated consumer expenditures, business expenditures, the expenditures required to produce full employment, and the difference between that amount and what was going to be spent by consumers and businessmen was the amount the government should spend in order to maintain full employment. So in order to do this, Mead, who was in the economics section, decided that it would be very interesting to study long-term contracts, because they would tell one what firms were going to spend and would help him in his calculations. So I was given a vast number of long-term contracts which were given by the firms, and which, of course, since ours was an office controlled by Winston Churchill, they were very pleased to do. So I got these contracts and I looked at them, and what I discovered was that they were altogether too imprecise, too vague. They wouldn't say when the goods were to be produced, where they were to be delivered, and so on. And this had an important effect on my thinking. It was quite clear that firms dealing with one another did not depend solely on the contract, but had understandings about what should be done, had trust in one another's actions, and the economic system obviously operated in a way different from the way it would if it was all based on contract, which was, of course, one's first assumption, but it's wrong, and we ought to study the relationships between firms as a way of operating in an economic system.